Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the online panel discussion on Iraq's protest movement and its political challenges and electoral limitations, hosted by the Center for Iranian Studies in Ankara, also known as İRAM. This online webinar will be conducted in English, and there is instant Arabic translation for both the guest speakers and the Arabic-speaking audience. Please note that the YouTube live stream is in English and the Zoom link is in Arabic. My name is Zaydoun Al-Kinani, and I'm a non-resident research fellow at Iran. Prior to starting with our topic, please allow me to briefly present to you İRAM. It was established in 2016 to conduct research on Iran and Iranian affairs. It is the first center of its kind in Turkey that focuses on Iran and its region. It also aims to generate solid and objective information and provide insights into the recent regional developments, and Iraq is at the core of İRAM's research focus. Moving to today's topic of the webinar, Iraq's October protest movement, or as it is also known as in Arabic, Thawra Tishrin. It all began on October 1st, 2019, when Iraqi protesters swept the streets of Baghdad and the southern provinces to challenge an imposed reality, failed democracy, rampant corruption, militias, sectarianism, unemployment, and poor public services. Post-2003 Iraqi society arguably began to move from identity politics to issue politics, starting from mid-2015, when the country was facing a major economic crisis after two consecutive terms by former Prime Minister Noor al-Maliki, and major assaults by an expanding Daesh towards further Iraqi territories. Around mid-July 2015, protests whelmed southern Iraqi cities and the capital Baghdad over poor public services. Bism al-Din Bagon al-Haramiyya was the slogan at the time, meaning in the name of the religion, the thieves robbed us. The popularity of that slogan reflects how the protest movement erupted from demands of economic reforms while directly targeting the political utilization of communal identities. Protests shifted from criticizing services to aiming at corruption, with an emphasis on replacing the Muhassasa regime with a secular and civic state. The October 2019 protests reflected a very strong and careful precaution towards any attempts by any political entity trying to override the momentum. This rebellion was definitely backboned by the previous protest movement, but its identity is more radical and firmer. It does not negotiate, it only sets the rules. People were no longer asking for better job opportunities, electricity, or water. They were calling to overhaul the system. In Reed Watan, we want a country. It was the current uprising's main slogan, in reference to a country that failed to provide them basic rights and services. The uprising's momentum reached its peak when former Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi announced his resignation in November 2019. However, any resignation was considered to be nothing more than a symbolic achievement, and this was evident through the movement's reactions to it, that this is not enough. People were aiming at changing the system and not particular figures. And this was a cornerstone in defining the resilience of the demands. Most of the demands from the October 2019 protests derived from the similar anxieties of the 2015 protest movement and all post-2003 Iraqi protests. However, the direct and confident violent response by the government and the armed group of the political parties have brought some more particular demands to the forefront, mainly the end of militant politics and influence, and to limit foreign interference in Iraqi affairs, particularly Iran. Finally, and most importantly, to open an investigation into the kidnapping, torturing, and murdering of peaceful protesters and holding the criminals accountable. This one could be seen as the least effective demand on one hand, but on the other hand, it was the most important one in terms of self-representation. Calling for the justice on behalf of the fallen protesters was a practical way of building an October 2019 revolutionary identity. Washington and Tehran, on the other side, exchanged a series of attacks against one another, starting with an attack on a Kirkuk airbase that left an American civilian contractor dead on December 27, 2019. The series of attacks led to a US airstrike that killed Qasem Soleimani and PMF's commander Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis at Baghdad International Airport on January 3, 2020. Soleimani was the commander of Iran's regional proxy expansionism. This event led to a militant march towards the US Embassy in Baghdad, where all pro-Iran politicians, parties, and militias joined hand in hand in denouncement of Soleimani and al-Muhandis murder. Just as the US-Iran confrontations were slowing down and protesters were preparing a revival, a globally spreading COVID-19 epidemic began. The slowdown in the protest momentum was also an opportunity for the political class to negotiate a new transition that would symbolically calm the protests and maintain their influence and presence. Following failed attempts by both Mohammed Tawfiq Alawi and Adnan al-Zurfi, the former chief of intelligence, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, replaced al-Zurfi on April 9th, 2020, and finally passed his government following that. After all, the candidates were members of the same political class and system which the people were protesting against from the first place. In July 2020, Prime Minister Kadhimi announced early elections to take place in June 2021. Within less than a year, this was postponed until October 2021. Whilst the Iraqi public opinion, observers, and both active and silent supporters of the protest movement had different opinions on whether it does make sense for the protest movement to participate in the early elections taking place in October 2021, despite the continuous violence committed against activists and protesters, this did not stop them from watching the political parties and figures emerging out of the October movement's political discourse and new realities. New political parties inspired by the October protest movement emerged, such as Al-Bayt al-Watani, October 25th Movement, Imtidad, Al-Khayma al-Iraqiyya, and many others. And what's interesting in the launching formations of those parties is that most of them are very careful with the way they present their affiliations or connections to the protest movement. The groups make it very clear that they do not intend to impose themselves as an authority over the demonstrations that began in October 2019, but instead they suggest that their platforms and desire to run for office is a way or a route to accomplishing some of the goals and objectives and aims of the uprising. There has been campaigns on issues such as registration, campaigns to raise awareness about helping citizens update their biometric voting cards. And these efforts come after the government's independent High Electoral Commission announced on January 2nd the cancellation of voter cards issued between 2013 and 2017. 1/3 of the eligible voters, that are around 8 million people, will not be able to vote because they were not registered in time. The violence, on the other hand, against prominent members of the protest movement, such as Ihab al-Wazini, who was assassinated earlier this week in Karbala and is arguably a potential candidate for the protest movement. Al-Wazni's assassination witnessed reaffirmations through statements by Al-Bayt al-Watani, the Iraqi Union for Work and Rights, and even current MPs such as Faq al-Sheikh Ali, that they will boycott the upcoming elections. Many political observers and analysts have also softened their approach towards the protesters' boycott of the upcoming elections, from highlighting the risk of being absent from the democratic process to highlighting that a more organized boycott with clear, unified, and collective objectives could be more productive. Today, it is my great pleasure to have a very distinguished panel of different experts, as you will see, that will address different issues on Iraq's October protest movement, its status quo, and upcoming challenges and potentials. We have Dr. Haider Saeed. He's an Iraqi academic and political researcher. He's also head of the research department and editor-in-chief of Siyasat Arabiya journal at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, joining us from Doha. We're also joined by Dr. Ali Taha Al-Hmoud, executive director of Al Bayan Center for Planning and Studies and a professor of political sociology at the University of Baghdad, and he's joining us from Baghdad. And finally, but not least, Mrs. Ina Rudolph, research fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, and is completing her PhD on the PMF and the implications for the future of Iraqi statehood at King's College London, joining us from Berlin. Each of our presenters will have 10 minutes to present their statements on the topic, and then we'll have around 20 minutes for Q&A and further engagement from the online audience. Audience joining us on Zoom or YouTube, please feel free to share your questions as we will raise them with our guests by the last 20 minutes of this 1-hour session. Without further ado, we will start the first presentation with Dr. Haider Saeed. Dr. Haider, the floor is yours. Please tell us more about the identity of the protest movement and what transformations have we witnessed since the outbreak of the uprising.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you, Mr. Zaidun.
أشكرك وأشكر مركز
And I thank you and Iran
هذه الندوة، وأيضا أحيي
for inviting me for this panel.
رودولف وعلي طاهر محمود.
And also I thank Ina Rodolf and Tahir Mahmoud.
قبل أن أبدأ بطرح
Before
حول
I propose some ideas
الحراك السياسي
about the political movements
ثورة تشرين، أنا أسميها ثورة.
for the October movements, I want to point out for two important comments.
ما سأقوله تحديدا أريد أن
What I'm
أقوله
saying,
هو خليط من رهان
I don't want to talk about myself, but
وتخيل. أنا
it's
لا أعتقد
the combination between betting and analysis. I cannot say it's fully an analysis.
التحليل، لا، هناك رهانات يعني
I'm making
منذ
some bets
بداية يعني
from the
الاحتجاجات
beginning
هذه
of the uprising.
أنا كتبت بدعم
I
هذه
have
الثورة،
wrote to support
حتى في
this
متابعة
movement,
لهذه الديناميكية
and by
السياسية
following
التي
this
تزرع
political dynamics
يعني
that are popping out from this revolution are all kind of bettings and are
النقطة
not
الثانية هو أنه
any analysis. And the
حدث
second note
خلال هذه
is
الأيام حادث
the
اغتيال
assassination
المناضلين
of one of the political revolution activist Rahab al-Wazni.
يعني نحن أيضا نتحدث، هذه الدورة
Now
تقام في فترة خليني
this is
أسميها تحول وعدم وضوح
this is a
أمور
transitional
الصراعات
point and
أصبحت
transitional
مشتتة
time,
بين عدة
and
قطاع من الدولة
this timing
وعديد خيارات.
is
يعني المعلوم أنه
limiting its options.
شكلت يعني بعد توقف العملية الاحتجاجية في الثورة
And all of this
كورونا وكانت
this transition movement and all developments have been stopped due to the corona pandemic.
قوى يعني أخذت مسميات وسجلت رسميا
And have been a couple of factions that have been officially recognized, and they have been officially inside of the elections in the
لكن
next of
هذه
October, next
الأحداث
October. But
أعادت
this
سؤال
choice
أو الجدوى المشاركة
makes us
الانتخابات
re-question the entering of
هناك
the upcoming
صراع
elections.
واسع بين هاي القوى
And there is a
وأنا
very
أذكر
huge open
شخصيا
conversation between these powers and these factions.
يعني في يوم
And
الثلاثاء
what I'm talking today, the Tuesday,
إلى الآن هناك
about
ما
this.
يشبه توافق نادر، خليني أقول، بين قوى الثورة
And there is
والقانون
now a very sensitive and a very rare
كل شيء موجود
agreement
يعني.
on
فهاتان الملاحظاتان
between all of these factions.
أصلا فيها نقاش وحراك بين
And we are talking currently right now in a very unstable moment and very undecisive times.
كما قلت أنا
From this
خليط
concept,
غريبة بين رهان وبين بيت.
my speech was gonna be a
وكنت متحفظا
combination between
على
betting and analysis.
الانفعالات المبكرة لطرح حتى بعض الأطراف في الثورة.
Uh,
كنت أحتجاج
I had my conservations on having an early election,
يستند إلى قراءتنا لما جرى في منطقتنا، يعني في البلدان اللي تشبهنا
and
في
this
الثورات
had been based
الديمقراطية.
on what happened to our neighbors and our neighboring cultures and neighboring
الانتخابات لم
systems.
تخطو إلى تحولات صحيحة.
And the elections have
الانتخابات
never
أصبحت
built good
يعني والآن
politics, and most of these elections have led to downturns and failures into the
كانوا
systems.
يجمعون على أن انتخابات 2005 كان
And
هناك
everybody
مؤامرة
have
لقادة
and
الاعتراض
those and the civil war between all of this have been a direct result to the elections of 2005, and
وكررت
everybody
تجربة
agrees on that.
الديمقراطية العربية في مصر وتونس.
And this also is a result, and by
بشكل
following the
ممارسة
all the revolutions that happened in Tunis and in
بعض من
Egypt.
أعرف من شباب الثورة أنه الانتخابات بالعادة
and
تكون فيها القوى المنظمة.
and from my knowledge and from the people that are saying, and the protesters, the actual protesters, they know They know that the people who win the elections are the organized people, not the people that they wanted, and the same as happened with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and the same that happened in Tunis.
قضية أكبر من قضية توفير إشراف دولي على الانتخابات أو
And the
استخدام
case is
العملة.
not this case is not about the watching of the elections and the keeping it safeguard and having an overwatch like an international overseer and overwatchers on it,
السياسيين فقط لا يستطيعون أن ينافسوا قوى لها خبرة 20 و30 و40
but I
سنة
don't think those people, the small
أكثر
peoples, the
سياسة
underdogs, who are
سياسية
able to
محترفة.
compete with
ومع
the
ذلك
veterans that have been competing for
يعني
20
تنمو
minutes,
أمال
for
الخير
20 over for 20 years.
هاي العملية ربما طموحات لدى البعض ربما ثقة
Some people are being a little bit ambitious, a little bit more ambitious, a little bit
وهي
hopeful,
لا
but
زالت الفكرة هي أنه نحن
the
نعيش
idea is
بعد
still that we are going through the struggle in a
أنا
political manner.
كنت طبعا من بين عوامل
I
عدم
was one of the
مجال المشاركة في
factors
الانتخابات
of
القادمة
the
يعني تكلمنا عنها
revolution,
وحدثنا عنها في مناسبات مختلفة وكثيرة
and we have talked
بس
about it before in different
أعتقد من
occasions,
العوامل الأساسية
and I want to
هو
focus on one of the main
أيضا إلى
factors.
حد ما تعبيرا عن
It
إطار
and the one
المشاركة
it is
السياسية
the
للشباب المفتقدة إلى مشاركة سياسية منظمة.
it was a representation and a cry out of the young people who have failed to contribute into the political system in Iraq, and they're uprising.
نخبة سياسية
And
جديدة
from 2003, we haven't been able to create a political elite. And as
وكان
and it
عندنا
is very surprising that we have moved out from a very closed
تنظيم
system, which was
مؤسسات
Saddam's system,
رئاسية
to a very
وعندنا
open
نخبة
system
شعبية.
with a very civil
لكن
system that
لماذا لا نستطيع
provides
إنشاء
these rights.
نخبة سياسية
Why
جديدة
couldn't
ونخبة
we
سياسية
create
جديدة
and
على الناحية
produce
السياسية؟
a
أي
new
النخبة
political
السياسية التي
elite?
كانت متشكلة في إطار المعارضة العراقية قبل 2003.
Mm,
يعني
And before this,
أنا
our
أستدعي
political elite have been the Iraqi
تصور
opposition.
جيل أراد أن
And I
يقضي
see
على
that one of the
جزء
factors that we have a
من
generation
المشاركة السياسية وهو الاحتجاج.
that wanted to be represented, and the only way that they could do it was to
وتكون
protest.
مجموعة من التنظيمات
And
بحاول أن تأطر قوى الثورة، ولا نستطيع أن نقول هي
and there's multiple organizations that are trying to
تختلف
tear
في
apart
العراق
the
وتنتشر
revolution
في مناطق مختلفة من العراق.
and
لكن
to break down the revolution, break down
مجموعة من الإسلام، لكن مع
the
ذلك
revolutions and the people, and it is
الإحتجاج
very hard to do that. And
هي تشكل إطار سياسي لاحتضان النخبة السياسية الجديدة، وهذا
and
هو
I
الذي
think that
نحن
these organizations provide a mainframe to the death of
مع
the
تلك التنظيمات.
political elite
كيف
and the
يمكن
political
للشباب
movements.
أن يخوضون عملية بناء تنظيم سياسي من دون نماذج سابقة؟ خلينا
And
نتذكر احنا البلد اللي عاش عصر
I
الثورة
remember that we have a lot
ثورة
of
كبرى في
young
سوريا
generations how they have been able to set a political faction and how they be able to set their own political
الشباب كانوا يخوضون بتجربة بناء تنظيم سياسي من دون نموذج
without having a role model,
كانوا
and how they
يتخذون
could build it
منصات
without having a role model and without being able to
وهنا
see something to copy from, and they have been successful in doing that.
الاحتجاج مصادر الثورة
And we know that the reasons
الآن
for
مرتبطة
oppositions and the
وربما
reasons of
ستكون هناك
unrest is still there, and there is an upcoming unrest.
وليس
Now,
في
what matters,
الانتخابات
not going
الطرق
through
السياسية بالمعنى
through the
العربي من
elections,
خلال البرلمان أو الحكومة. يعني
without
العملية
going
السياسية
not
تختلف
going through
كثيرا. من يبي نفسه
the
يخوض
elections, the
تجربة الانتصار.
parliaments, and fighting over power.
في تقديري الأهم في التجربة
But what
ربما
matters
القرار الذي سيتخذ
to
من
learn from and
القوى
to
المنتخبة
learn
من
from the
العراق
past
وهي
of
معتمد على
the last
سواء
uprising,
تقاطع الانتخابات أو لا تقاطع قسم منها
whether
يشارك.
or not to
المهم
participate
هو
in the elections or not.
يتشكل هذا الإطار الذي
What
ممكن أن
matters
يحتضن
that
موجات من
the
الاحتجاج
framework
اللي
is
هي
being made,
مجرد هؤلاء الشباب سيشاركون.
the framework that
والتحدي سيكون
can
متى سيكون
compensate and can include and integrate those movements, the political movements that are upcoming and uprising, and the revolutions that have been in 2019 have happened with no political framework, which led to its failure. And currently, that we have this we have this framework that, and we can see that the main direction between all the political factions, we have to, if we wanted to create a political organization, we cannot be described as an opposition and an uprising organization, and we have to combine between a protesting force and an organizational force. And we have a lot of uh, examples like Lebanon. We have it from 2015. We have uh, l- couple of organizations that have spurred up in Lebanon that are something that they had something that combines between the civil community and society and the political organization and the protesting force. And I think that maybe now, starting from these uprisings, and I think what is more important than going into the elections, what is more important is that we have developed a framework that could compensate and include these protests and this unrest in the political movement in Iraq. And I think this is the future of Iraq. This is the future of the Iraqi political situation.
Shukran.
And
Thank
thank you
you very
very
much.
much.
So, if I may summarize very quickly what you said, which is very rich, Ihab al-Wazni's recent assassination definitely raised concerns again about the elections, and the elections seems to be a target easily gained by the organized political parties, whether in Iraq or beyond. And we still haven't been able to establish a new political elite in post 2003 Iraq. And the most important factor here is that entering elections is not the significant or the most focused step for the protest movement, but the most important step here is that the movement have matured enough to manage the upcoming upheavals in a more organized way. Thank you very much for this. The next speaker is Ina Rudolph, who will talk more about the impact of the continuous violence against protesters and how that will have on the political level and beyond. Mrs. Ina, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. I would like to present my arguments against framing the current escalation of violence as merely the product of a proxy war or of geopolitical rivalries, because as you also have mentioned, this would simply not pay respect to the grassroots character of the Iraqi protest movement. Just to remind some of the slogans of the protest movement, it hasn't always been Tahran barra barra, but it was very much about fighting corruption. Slogans like Baghdad hurra hurra, Fasad barra barra, or No Muqtada no Hadi. So as we can see, the public discontent was primarily targeted at the incompetence of government decision makers to come up with an adequate plan to cleanse the entire system against the backdrop of external spoilers. We have seen that despite this initial upsurge of Iraq first rhetoric, especially after the last parliamentary elections, subsequent administrations had failed to deliver on the promises to make best even of Iraq's geopolitical stakes. So they have, on multiple occasions, we have listened to government officials vouching to prioritize like national interests, like seek to develop Iraq from a battlefield into a talent hub, into a hub for foreign investments. But in a lot of occasions, they still compromise like their initial commitment for partisan and for personal gains. And this is where I think the tolerance threshold of Iraq's constituents has been reached. Rather than searching for a way like to break the cycle of corruption and mismanagement, we are still witnessing transactional politicking and individually motivated attempts to appease external patrons. I have personally been more concerned with this relationship with external sponsors, which has often hindered the capacity of Iraq's decision makers to keep their promises to made to Iraqi protesters, to mitigate the destructive influence of non-state armed groups. And we have been more or less like witnessing this vicious cycle. As you mentioned in the beginning, I think one of the most dangerous side effects of this would be complete political disillusionment. For example, if forces or activists affiliated with the protest movement feel too intimidated or like too discouraged to participate in the established governance system because like they basically like see no way forward. But I would say like that I am still optimistic because still the resilience that we witness of the protest movement shows like that there is no tolerance left for politicians' preoccupations with pleasing or catering to external sponsors. With not much left to lose, like as we spoke in the beginning about the recent round of politically motivated assassinations, they are just they have no more patience for Iraqi decision makers to push off the responsibility to external elements or to so-called third parties. And this is like my main argument at the end, like it should be about the capacity of the state to protect the political process and also to restore confidence in the political process and in the democratic institutions of the state. Seeking to reclaim their homeland, I think the current protest movement across Iraq has once again revealed the extent to which Iraq's governing elites unfortunately do tend to prioritize their relationship with external backers and often at the cost of long-term national interests. Unfortunately, the declared territorial defeat of the self-proclaimed Islamic State has still not created enough political momentum to finally kickstart the long overdue reconstruction process. And I think analysts of the current dynamics should also address the bigotry of the key stakeholders and also the fluidity of their vested interests. The opportunism that we witness of the main actors basically demonstrates that they still seek to preserve the beneficial status quo, and that it just makes it easier for them to subsume the whole conflict to the level of who is an Iranian marionette or who is a Western lackey. And I think just these categories are a futile exercise, and more importantly, they tend to divert the attention away from the unprecedented grassroots character of the protest movement, and also like to distract, to confuse the whole debate about the responsibility of the state as the sovereign, as the guarantor of rule of law in Iraq. Packaging also an issue-based protest movement primarily as a byproduct of geopolitical rivalries would distort the cross-sectarian weariness with the dysfunctionality of the established governance system. And therefore, I think that the legitimate demands of the protesters should be analyzed instead through the prism of deep-seated grievances that are only being exacerbated through power sharing schemes and also like to the inability to formulate Iraq first policies. In my perspective, one of the main spoilers to any progress has been indeed the lack of political will by often, unfortunately, externally backed elites to jeopardize their personal relations with sponsors. In view of Iraq's, I would say, internally fragmented and externally contested parliamentocracy, restoring Iraq's sovereignty has devolved into an empty catchphrase. I doubt that a lot of the audiences, especially those affiliated with the protest movement, take such catchphrases seriously. As disenfranchised communities, they no longer like have the patience to wait out on the numerous promises of handshake diplomacy, because very little of these foreign investment promises have actually ended up improving their quality of living or created new prospects for personal and professional development. And the problem is that even in cases where foreign investors like have decided like to participate and to contribute like to Iraq's economic development, a lot of the deals have been jeopardized by particularistic interests on the ground. And here I'm speaking about my own research and addressing the role both of non-state, but also of an array of parastate and hybrid actors who often have their own allies and advocates embedded very deep within the formal bureaucracy of the state. So just to conclude, I think that unfortunately Iraq's elites have accumulated a track record of keeping their eyes wide shut whenever it comes to the misappropriation of public funds, whenever it comes to, let's say, sabotage in investment bids. And to make matters worse, we've seen that paying lip service to slogans such as Al-Qarar Iraqi has unfortunately not enabled the political blocs to convince constituents of their commitments to stand up for Iraqi interests. On the contrary, ruling elites have creatively opted to craft a multi-vector foreign patrons approach of their own, and I reckon that such an oligarchic interpretation of international diplomacy has only helped them entrench themselves deeper and boost their institutional grip on power. So I'm a bit sad of having to end on such a pessimistic note, but I sincerely hope that maybe also like to connect to the contribution of Dr. Haider, that there is still a chance like for those who risk their lives by participating in an issue-based protest movement by arguing for structural reforms, that some level of confidence can be indeed restored prior to the upcoming elections.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ina. Thank you for that. Before I move to Dr. Ali Taher, I would like to remind the audience that we are having the questions after Dr. Ali's contribution. So please feel free to drop your questions on the chat or the Q&A section. Now we'll turn to Dr. Ali Taher Al-Hmoud, who will probably tell us more about the insider insights of the protest movement. Dr. Ali, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, IRAM Center, for this opportunity. The same as Ina said and Dr. Haider said, and this very rich introduction. And I mourn all our martyrs, the martyrs of October's revolution. I want to go back a little bit backwards for the 2015 uprising. What happened inside of this uprising? There is two events that very important events that happened in the protest process, and there has been a lot of the leftist and communist protesters. These protests are not represented by anyone, and this have prevented from the creation of political elite at its moment, at the moment of its creation. And the second event that failed, they have failed to develop. They have failed to ally themselves with the Sadric movement, which is why the concept of my enemies is my friend. And the concepts and one of these concepts that the uprisings and protests have no head, and these prot- just protesting in the streets has a goal and is important. And as my colleagues have explained, and looking at the lack of these three things, there is no structure and programs and leaders. These are the three things. These have changed the protests and the uprising. This have allowed to be a compensating and cooperation fields and led it to and led without having the leadership and without having these three things have led to have these protesting to represent to have a lot of people that don't represent those protesters and don't represent those factions, and they had no horizon of protesting, and there has been no event that could have stopped these protests. I have not put a ceiling to these protests, and now protests have become the revolution, the goal. And as we can see, the infighting and the infighting and these, as we all know, that this is part of the game rules, and this is the very important things that happened. Another understanding that have been developed, that this October parties have, it is very hard for it to be able to produce a very good result in the upcoming elections, which have led to a very internal desire of not to participate in these elections, ending up with the assassinations of Alain Nasser. And I want to comment on this situation, and we can see that Mark Zuckerberg have talked about that politics are based on accepting the other, communicating and conversing, making compromising. It it cannot be built on being angry or not having compromises, but it should be a tool to achieve political goals. But if not, it will have a problem, like the elections of 2005. In the 2005, all the Sunnis have withdraw and boycotted the elections, which led to a legal a non-representative government, a non-representative people, which led to the civil war in 2006 and 2007. 61% of people boycotted the 2019 election, which led to a legal system which has a very, like, it is a legitimate system with zero support or very low support, which led to the massacres on the hands of the militias and the factions, like the 800 massacre and the 800 martyr massacre. And these elections are just, and we can see that a bad election could be a prelogue and a preparing to a good elections later. But but weak weak elections from the participation level will lead to a very tyrant system and a very bad system. And by by by boycotting, that would lead to a very corrupt system. And there's been a lot of people that have been, and those all of these people have been trying and working to be able to compete on all of these factions. One of the uh, one of the boycotting, like the civil boycotts, which is needs to have a very huge organization, not just the people and the local leaders of them saying, but the people's desire from their own heart to do it. And these people, and it is their own choice to boycott. What if that people have the motivation of the new election rules and election rules, and have people have participated heavily? How, what would be the what would be the future of the boycott, and what would be the future of the power? And I think that boycott should be the last the last choice, and it has the meaning and the goal of completely disassembling the system. So, and about me for reducing the cost of sacrifice. And I ask for the October political factions and to contribute and to get into the elections and to leave to be able to contribute and to collect all the factions into and get them into the parliament, and and even having small amounts and small numbers of people to contribute would lead to a very good contribution and to a very good leading to focusing on certain files and issues and cases that are really needed to be like from freedom cases and social cases that need to be watched and need to be taken care of. And this will and protesting is not the goal and not the target, but should be just be the tool to be able to achieve this, because change does not happen a day and a night, and it cannot happen without being testing, and cannot be done without improvement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time. I will, before I move to the Q&A section, I will share my questions to each one of you. The first question will be to Dr. Haida Saeed. You mentioned how the October protest movement should find a way to influence policymaking or ensuring that they have a place in Iraq's political system, in the future of Iraq's political system, whether it is as a protest movement or in a future political system. So, if we would say if political parties affiliated or inspired from the October protest movement participate in the elections, are there chances in influencing policymaking high or low in future governance, or will that depend on their coalitions with the political parties that they protested against from the first place?
عفوا، شكرا استاذ زيدون. يعني
Thank you, Mr. Zaidan.
من خلال موقفي مره اخرى انا قلنا يعني نحن نخلط بين الرهان وبين التحديد.
I always mix up between the analysis and betting.
دكتور علي، انا
I disagree with my friend Dr. Ali,
من تشرين في الانتخابات.
and I do this. I am not with boycotting.
المقاطعه طبعا، وانا وخليني
I
مع دكتور علي
I recognize between the differences between boycotting and not.
يعني المقاطعه
Not contributing is so different from boycotting, because boycotting is a form of protest,
واللي تشهد مثل ما شهد العراق سقوط انظمه استبداديه، تبدا المشاركه. وانا مره كتبت مقاله هذا الاتجاه، تبدا
and all the participating
النسبه
and participating have been measured, and it always starts from a very big participation percentages and then go get low, and as in 2005 have been 67%, and we are going on a down low on the contribution, and we have reached a low in 2018. But this is not a boycott, this is just
وبين نزع الشرعيه تشرين عن الانتخابات. انا اعتقد الامران
and there's a huge difference between the removing the legitimacy of the October Revolution from these elections or not. This is the first time that like a government has fallen because of a protest,
اطلقت ثوره تشرين.
and this has been because of this framework that have been created by the October Revolution.
انا في تقديري
In my assessment,
ستكون جزءا من الشرعيه
this
التي ستضفى على مخرجات هذه الانتخابات باي شكل كانت.
this power is going to give the legitimacy to whomever it wants.
في المنطقه من
Would
سيفوز هو القوى المنظمه.
and for with our all experiences that the only the very experienced and organized faction is the one who's gonna win the elections,
وبالتالي
because everyone asks for development,
انتخابات لاضفاء الشرعيه. ولذلك انا اتصور
and all of the results of this election are gonna used to get a legitimacy, and I think that it is a defense mechanism of the current system is to hold an early election, and we have to wait till all of the powers of October Revolution to accept and agree that that these elections are not going to achieve anything, and only at this time the legitimacy of these elections are going to be revoked, and I think that these revolution and these early elections are just a tool to return the system to what it was back then.
There is a question from Mr. Wathiq Abdel Nabi, which he asked earlier in the session, and I believe both Dr. Ali and Dr. Haider answered it already. And I will read it in Arabic. It is in Arabic. أيهما أفضل من وجهة نظركم، مشاركة القوى والتيارات التشرينية في الانتخابات أم لا، سواء كمرشحين أو ناخبين؟ I believe both of you answered this, so I will move to a question by محمد كريم الخاقاني. هل تعتقدون بأن مقاطعة القوى والأحزاب
Do you think that the boycotting of powers and factions will lead of the October 2019 will lead to results on the civil level, or by the boycotting calls is a message that there is no point in rejoining these elections?
This is Ina, can you hear us? I think you're muted.
Thank you very much. I think the problem is with the cycle that we are currently witnessing, and that's a cycle of dysfunctionality. So I totally understand Dr. Haider's point that the system is trying to preserve itself because the current status quo, as I've tried to address in my presentation, is very lucrative for an array of stakeholders, and not just for the stakeholders represented in the ruling parties. So I would argue that they acknowledge that the point has been reached where the system has to become more inclusive. But they also have a view on the budgets. They have a view on, let's say, the financial status quo. And they realize the need to introduce austerity measures. Now, we all know that such measures, especially like those trying to downsize the public sector, or also like to revisit the whole discussion of having like subsidized state services, is going to cost a lot of those actors their popularity. So in their perspective, being able to attract representatives of the protest movement would make it like easier for them to scapegoat them, to say like, listen, like this is not just a unilateral decision. Here we have like also representatives from civil society, etc. They're here like to bear the costs. And I think like the more mature the protest movement becomes, the more cautions they would also get, because they would know that there is a lot of appetite out there, that the moment they enter the political system, that they can be sort of like scapegoated, and that a lot of responsibility, especially for unpopular measures, can be sort of like transferred onto them. And on the other hand, I can imagine that they are weary of the prospect of wanting to push things forward, right? Like to achieve some tangible results for Iraq. And here Dr. Ali also mentioned, like it's very difficult like to be constructive on the side of boycott. But if they want to be constructive, if they want to start engaging more, there is of course like always the risk that they are being forced or persuaded to make compromises, to make concessions on some of their principles. And like then on the other hand, like to be held accountable for that. So like that their supporters out on the streets start perceiving them as part of the same corrupt system. And I think like the most dangerous, once again, the most dangerous outcome would be like to know that everyone who enters the political system would become corrupt, and that the rift between like those willing to govern or those willing to shape governance or shape Iraqi statehood remain on the one side of the barricade, and the others are completely sort of like excluded or decide to self-exclude from everything that's happening.
Great, thank you very much. Moving back to Dr. Ali, you focused a lot on the three main approaches towards the upcoming stages of the October protest movement, and that is to either boycott the upcoming elections or participate in the upcoming elections and guarantee an opposing voice in parliament, or for the protest movement to strengthen itself as a political entity and perhaps participate in the elections in the long-term future when a political environment is probably safer, on another hand, if we look at it that way. Do you believe that this dilemma of having so many different options, and we're witnessing so many different groups and individuals of the protest movement believing in so many clashing opinions of what to do in the current stage, whether to react politically with the elections or whether to not? Do you believe this dilemma will further divide the protest movement? Dr. Ali? Dr. Ali Tahir? I think the mic is unmuted. If someone can just message him, I will. Dr. Ali Tahir, can you hear us? No?
طيب شكرا جزيلا. بالحقيقة يعني ربما أيضا نتذكر أنا ودكتور حيدر بأن الانتخابات ما كان في البداية الانتخابات
And we remember, as from Dr. Haidari, that originally the elections wasn't, the choice wasn't the early elections. And the change of the, and all of these were the choices of the protesters. And if there had been any leadership to this protest, we could have argued that was it their choice or not, or was it just like titles and slogans. But I'm wondering if Dr. Haider is asking for boycotting. He's not asking. He wants to remove the legitimacy of the October Revolution from the upcoming elections. But what after removing the legitimacy? When we remove the legitimacy of the 2018 and 2005 legitimacy, and the costs have been incredibly high. What would we do after we remove the legitimacy? What would we do as the October factions? And do we expect that we are able to develop and grow to be able to compete to compete in these, and the maturity comes from experience and comes from being included in these processes, in the political process. And if they just before that, people usually contributed just to these factions contributed to 10%, but now it's up to 20%. And it's not expected that those factions are gonna be getting into the like they're gonna get into the elections, and then they're gonna get 50+1 from the elections. And this would be the an answer to Zaidun's questions. And these disagreements and the dilemma between that you mentioned earlier, Dr. Zaidun, would be this dilemma that is being used, and it exists relatively right now, and we're waiting for the situation that are gonna show up as to either to contribute and to boycott the upcoming elections. And so what is the next step? What is after that? This is what matters.
We have questions on the chat asking us how do we participate in this panel discussion. The question specifically is from Abdul Qadir and Nail. Please feel free to share your question on the Q&A or in the chat, and we will share it with the guest speakers. Another question from Dr. Diya Saleh. I'll read it in Arabic. It's written in Arabic. التصعيد في أعقاب عمليات الاغتيال، كيف تقرؤون تأثيره على مكانة الحركة الاحتجاجية؟
The escalating in assassination attempts. How do you read this on the outlook of the protesting movements, and the callings of some people to have revenge and to carry the and carry the weapons in the the socio-geographical location and everyone, and in the and will everything would be okay.
سؤالا واحدا يعني طبعا فكرة أنه عملية الاغتيال الأخيرة في كربلاء هي أطلقت
and
تعتبر
the last Karbala assassination attempt
خلينا نضع
have
الأمور في
resulted into a very
في
important way.
نصابها. أنا كتبت نص يعني
I have wrote
اسمه ثورة تشريع الرهانة هو فقوع
uh,
سياسي، نشر في الصيف الماضي في مجلة الثقافة الجديدة.
I published in the
طرحت
new
فيه فكرة أنه
culture magazine. I published
يعني
this
ما
paragraph.
يسيطر على شباب
What
الثورة على
takes over
الموجودين
the people
وليس
of the
إسقاط النظام
revolution
بالكامل،
is
العودة
not
إلى
the
النقطة الصفر،
it's not the
يعني لحظة
complete
تشبه لحظة
removing
2003 وإعادة بناء نظام سياسي
removing
جديد
of the
من
system
الصفر.
and
ومجرد طرح
the
فكرة
very
الانتخابات
starting point
المختلفة
of
على
the
أنها أمر
starting.
ضمن النظام القائم، يعني ضمن النظام
So the
الدستوري
calling
وقواعد
of
القيادية
having a
الدستورية.
new an early elections is just
طيب
to be
أنا
able
قلت
to
الرهان المطروح هو إجراء
working in the
إصلاح
framework, the
ديمقراطي
current
كامل
framework,
داخلي،
to create a new
إصلاح
framework.
جذري، وممكن من
And
يقوم
we
بهذا
need
الإصلاح
to
هناك
have
أطراف من داخل
a
الحكومة
major
السياسية
and an
يشرفوا
essential
على هذا المجلس ويشرفوا
reforms.
بعملية الانتقال الديمقراطي اللي جرت في
And
المرحلة
it's and we need this looks a
شخص
lot
أطراف من
like the
داخل النظام
Latin America's
تحركوا على
peaceful
معارضة
political transition. And
وقادوا
when
عملية إصلاحية، يعني هذا اللي انبنى عليه كل الحقل اللي يسموه بالعلوم السياسية الترانسيتولوجي، دراسات الانتقال الديمقراطي، اللي هو عملية
and for
تحديد
all this
حل أزمة سياسية
transology
وتحدث بين منظومة إصلاحية
discussions
معارضة وإصلاحية
and how
للنظام.
people from both the
فلماذا
opposition and the
خليني
system
أخذ
are
مثلا
trying to
تحت
fix up
تناظر أنه إذا كان
the
هذا اللي
system.
مسيطر عليه إحنا دخلنا في إطار تفاوضي،
And now we
النظام
are
نفسه
in the
وبين القوى اللي إذا نطقت
compromise
بإصلاح. وأنا في
framework,
تقديري
a negotiational
النظام
framework.
بدولته العميقة، يعني
And now as
هذا
the
المصطلح
system and
ظهر
its
في
deep
أمام
state.
منصة تركيا، وهذا المصطلح ظهر في تركيا.
And you can see
هذه
that
العلاقة
this
نستطيع أن
have
نتحدث
been
عن
appeared
دولة
in
مبنية
Turkey.
عن جهاز أمني سري إلى حد ما،
And
هو
now that
يعمل
we have a
للحفاظ على
security
أمن النظام.
organization and a security institute that is a secret institute as
هذا
the
الطرف
intelligence community.
هو أدرك أنه إحنا داخلين إلى تفاوض، خلص أكو حكومة استقالت ويجب أن نسلم بهذا، يعني إحنا في ضغط احتجاجي
And
يجب على الدولة أن
knowing
يقدم
that
تنازلات،
and we are
لكن
in
علينا
this
أن
part that
نقلل
we are asking that
التنازلات التي يمكن
the
أن
system to
تقبلها،
make
وكانت
compromises, but
عمليات
we have to
التغيير
limit the amount of
وعمليات
compromises the
الترهيب. هاي
system is going to do.
وظيفتها تحديدا، وظيفته هو تقليل ما يمكن أن يقدم النظام من خسائر
And
ومن
these
تنازلات.
institutions'
كل
goal is
القوى
to keep
بغض
the
النظر
system from giving that much compromises
أنا
and
في
to reduce the amount
تقديري
of compromises done by the system as much
يعني
as possible.
طيب هل من المنطقي أن نقبل يعني
Well,
أنا
one of my
يعني
questions is it
أنا
logical
أنا
to
تجربتنا
accept
بالعراق أنه الكتل النيابية الصغيرة لا قيمة لها بالعمليات لا البرلمانية
our
ولا السياسية، يعني حتى كتل من 10 ومن 15 مقعد لن
and we
تغير
have
شيء.
the
يعني احنا مثلا التحالف
coalitions in
المدني
the
في
parliament
المنطقه
have
بديمقراطيه
10
التحالف
or 15
اليساري عضو
coalitions
مصعد للبرلمان بثلاث
from
مقاعد،
the leftists
لكن
to
عمليا لم
civil like
تؤدي الى شيء،
liberals
لم
to
تتحول الى قوه
and
داخل
they
صندوق
haven't
العمليه
been
السياسيه.
united and they
وبالتالي
all of these coalitions
يمكن
have
النظام
never been
حزم او ضرب
an
او
active portion
اثر على
inside of
10
the
مقعد
political
او
force.
15 او 20 مقعد، بالتالي
So
سيتحول
having
جزء من الاطار التجميلي للنظام السياسي وليس
and
رفع الانتخابات
whenever
الرئاسيه.
you have this people
طيب
will enter if
الرهان
the
ليس على
revolutionary
فرض
people
العمليه
factions
السياسيه نفسها.
get
شنو
inside of
معنى
the
الموقع
system they would be
الاحتجاجي؟
just
الموقع الاحتجاجي هو
viewed
أن
as
قواعد
part of
التفكك
that
والتغيير.
system and
خلينا
they would just
نتذكر
be beautifying the system
حركة
without actually
التضامن
fixing it.
في بولندا ومتى تغير النظام. نحن
And we have
نتحدث
to
عن
see that
عملية إصلاح طويلة، مو بالضرورة تحدث خلال يوم أو يومين حتى أو سنة وسنتين، لكن
and
يجب أن
we're not expecting
أن
that the
نكون
change is
واعيين
gonna
في
happen
المسألة
in 1 or 2 years.
باعتبارنا قوة احتجاجية. النظام بعد استقالة عادل عبد المهدي وكانت هناك أكثر من
And
خيار
the system after the
لو أن
resignation of Adel Abdel
رئيس
Mahdi,
الوزراء القادم ممكن أن يطرح أنه أنا سأقود عملية إصلاح ضرب
and I have thought that
مكان
the next
فكرة
prime
النظام
minister would
الإصلاحي.
lead uh,
بكل بصراحة وربما
a
تجدني
developmental
يعني
plan,
أتحدث بهذه
and I would
الصيغة.
be
أنا ما
open. And I don't think
الشيخ مصطفى الكاظمي كان هو الرجل المؤهل
that Mustafa al-Kazemi was the one who was
لعملية
prepared and was qualified to be able to
كنا
do
في
this.
حاجة إلى رئيس
And
وزراء
we needed a
خليني
better
أقول أكثر حزما.
and we needed a stronger and firmer prime minister. And the upcoming elections can result into, can choose a prime, and it could get a leader that can be firmer and be strengthened, and can be able to hold on the factions side. And we can understand that we have that a lot of how the internal and the external affairs are being handled by the government, and how people are very much critical to it. And now that we have the COSME strategy, which is kind of like how the consultants of the COSME name how his strategies work, and how he is being able to deal with all the neighboring countries, and how the COSME administration are capable of dealing with the issues, and having the pressure from the street will keep the system in in the compromising state. And all the people and all the external forces want him to stay, and for him to stay, that will be done through compromises. And having these compromises, I don't think that these assassinations are going to be a geopolitical struggle and fight and war. Can everything be returned as it was? And I think that it's the October movement is closer to the Sadri movement, but and I think that I don't think that these factions
Back
will
to you,
affect that much.
Mrs. Ina. You talked a lot about the anti-Iran sentiment during the movement. What is one of the protest movement's common and significant slogans since the outbreak of the October uprising, October 2019 uprising, until this week, recently, when Ihab al-Wazni was assassinated in Karbala, as we previously mentioned, and there was the attack against the Iranian consulate? Why is the protests movement filled with so much anti-Iran sentiment, or to be more precise, anti-Iranian interference in Iraq? What does this youth activist awareness towards Iranian role in Iraqi politics tell us about Iran's future in Iraq or the region? Ina, you're muted, I think.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think we have to differentiate between the slogans and whom they are addressing. Because like, even though they do associate the majority of the non-state, of the irregular, of the unruly groups with some level of Iranian backing, they still address the Iraqi government. They expect the Iraqi government like to be held accountable. Like they expect the administration of Mustafa al-Kadhimi also like to punish the perpetrators, like not just for the recent assassinations, but also to mention Hisham al-Hashimi, who was also assassinated on the street. And as we see, like this intimidation campaign is not just targeting activists, but it's also like targeting experts that have invested time to understand like the way their networks function. And just like to underline why we shouldn't like focus on the Iranian variable. All of these Iraq militia factions are currently mobilizing on their online channels for the upcoming elections, right? Like they're trying to mobilize support. They're trying like also to encourage their loyalists to go and to vote. And this tells us one thing: for one reason or the other, they have more trust in the utility of the state system as it is than the protest movement, because like they have spent enough time like being deeply entrenched in the bureaucracy of the state to know which strings to pull to achieve like their agendas. And I think like that this is a very important point that we should like try to tackle in a more constructive way. So like just to move away from the discussion of like whether to participate in the early elections or not, I think the question is how can those forces be prepared before a potential participation in elections? What sort of like policy-oriented trainings like can be organized? And here I'm really not speaking of some fashionable, you know, like Western branded training like in policy analysis, but really like by Iraqi political actors who understand the system, who have like spent like some time governing or as part of the public administration, and like who can go with them like through the different steps of like how to push for reforms, how to package and like frame legislative texts. Because even in the best case scenario like that they end up entering the system, then they would be left completely unprepared and would face like much more risks of being sort of like abused by other more experienced actors as sort of a legitimation bonus or like something to justify like their own presence and operation within the existing system.
Thank you, Ina. Final question to Dr. Ali. We're a bit over time and we apologize for that. Dr. Ali, our discussion today heavily focused on the challenges and obstacles faced by the protest movement today. Can we list some of the protest movement's strengths and achievements? And is Iraq, or to be more precise, Iraqi political discourse, very different following October 2019 in a positive way, or even negative? And can we refer to this period as post-October 2019 Iraq, just like we refer to post-2003 Iraq, but of course in different ways as mentioned? Dr. Ali.
شكرا جزيلا. طبعا بالتأكيد العراق بعد تشرين ليس كما سبقه يعني مطلقا. شكل العراق، هوية العراق، المعادلات السياسية بالتأكيد ليس كما في السابق. وهنا أيضا أؤيد كلام إنا عندما تحدثت في البداية عن الواقع الاقتصادي اللي يحكم البلد، اللي هو بالنهاية شكل تحدي كبير أمام الدولة، وهو أحد المحركات الأساسية بالاحتجاجات. وخليني هنا أيضا أشير إلى سؤال
Ina has mentioned earlier that I totally agree with Ina on the effectiveness of the economical factors on the next steps. And the assassinations are considered as a challenge and an opportunity. And these challenges are always shaped by the assassination. And we have to, one of the challenges that is the people that are asking to raise arms against those people. And this is one of the first challenges. The second challenge is these assassinations can be targeted to decrease the amount of participation in the upcoming elections. We know that inside of Iraq, we have very weak participation in the elections, meaning that meaning that the people of the Sadri movements will get the most votes, and we can see that the challenges can be seen from this angle. The opportunity is that this
للناشطين للفاعلين في ساحات الاحتجاج
can
من أجل إبقاء صفيحة الاحتجاج ساخنة.
This can keep the fire and it can keep the fire and keep the energy of the October movements, and it will keep it going as there, and it will lead to people that can be radically change the system from inside, or the heavily participation of the October movements inside of the parliamentary, and having the October factions to contribute and participate from in the parliament and in the political, and to contribute in the political process. And these factions should try and should get experienced, and they have to go through the compromises and negotiations and the acceptance and the contributing in the political process, and the producing of the anti-Iranic rhetoric. In we can understand the using these anti-Iran rhetoric can put pressure on the uh, on the Iranian on the Iranian factions will indirectly pose a pressure on the current system and the current government, uh, and they are considered they actually cause pressure and put pressure on the power, the state powers, by making that Iran is losing a part of the Iraqi society by these. The anti-Iran rhetoric is putting so much pressure under the Iranian, which indirectly put a lot of pressure on the system.
Ashkar for your insights about the current of Iraq's October protest movement and its existing challenges and possible potentials. Iraq's October uprising needs hours and days of investigation and discussions. Regardless, and nevertheless, your contribution has been very valuable. I know time is short and passes very quickly, but unfortunately, we have to conclude this webinar session. This webinar video will be uploaded on the YouTube link, and we hope to continue these productive academic discussions on Iraq and the region. Thank you, and assalamu alaikum.